Health concerns, and kidney disorders in particular, are unpleasant. We must move swiftly to safeguard our priceless kidney filters. 6 easy things you may do first thing in the morning that can halt or even reverse the decrease of GFR are demonstrated in this video. Even in the early stages of chronic kidney disease, these routines can have a significant impact. Improving your kidney health and avoiding the dreaded dialysis machine are both possible with a few simple adjustments to your daily routine. Continue your trip with us to discover these behaviors that will change your life and begin your path to better health right now. Now let's find out which morning routines really work. Number 6. First thing in the morning, let's be sure to have a healthy meal that will fuel our body's vital filters. Here, we are not exaggerating. There are meals that can make a difference since they will assist increase the flow of nutrients from your arteries to your vital filters, like for example, beets. Oh, we love to eat beets or beetroots, depending on where you reside. And this root is extremely wonderful for your circulation since it is incredibly rich in nitrates. Your body turns nitrates into nitric oxide, which in turn relaxes arteries and enhances flow to organs and tissues. If you want your GFR to improve, you want to make this one a regular on your table. Another food with extraordinary properties. Blueberries. Blueberries and strawberries include flavonoids which help widen arteries, prevent plaque development, and enhance the flow of nutrients in the capillaries. Remember, that's precisely what we aim to achieve with our ideal breakfast. And also consider tomatoes. What? We bet you guys already know that tomatoes are on the avoid or restrict lists of many websites. But did they ever tell you how wonderful for you this very misunderstood item truly is? Tomatoes may help lower the activity of angiotensin-converting enzyme, ACE, which causes blood vessels to tighten and to elevate pressure. Have you ever heard about ACE inhibitors? They function precisely like that. They inhibit the activity of angiotensin-converting enzyme, and this immediately opens up your arteries and enhances arterial flow. Studies suggest that tomato extract can inhibit ACE, decrease inflammation, and disrupt platelet aggregation. And that's wonderful for better circulation. Another food with extraordinary properties, walnuts. Walnuts are particularly excellent for the filters of the body since they are exceptionally rich in omega-3 fatty acids. Walnuts truly are one of the greatest plant-based sources of omega-3s, and they are also filled with nutrients such as vitamin E and arginine, which work to stimulate your body's generation of nitric oxide. This is why nuts can help you lower blood pressure as well as reduce inflammation. Just don't overeat them. To receive the advantages, you simply need to eat a few nuts every day for breakfast. Number 5. Well, my friends, looks like we have some fruit and veggies we can simply add to our morning to convert it into a healthy habit. And there are some additional things you can do to put your well-being first every morning. Start the morning with a cup of coffee. Many people believe coffee not very beneficial for you, but they are mistaken. Black and sugary coffee in the morning is actually a healthful habit if you consume it in moderation. Science ties moderate coffee drinking to a decreased risk of cardiac issues. Also, patients with T2D may benefit from coffee since it helps metabolize sugar better. And coffee can also offer you greater energy in the morning. Now the greatest part, you can use that additional energy to exercise first thing in the morning. Morning workouts can lead to eating better, feeling more aware, and having an overall better day. So take use of the early inspiration to assist increase your GFR. Exercising frequently is the most efficient strategy in the world of preventing you against hypertension, excessive sugar levels, and cholesterol. Many people don't realize this, but exercise is also related with decreased acidity in the body. Another wonderful technique to increase your GFR, remember that simply walking more regularly or using the stairs instead of the elevator is a terrific way to start. Just be ready, and the intensity doesn't matter. Another good habit you can try, especially if you need to lose a few pounds or to improve T2D, is intermittent fasting. Intermittent fasting is an excellent way of losing weight if you need to and to improve a long list of metabolic markers. A recent trial is even showing that intermittent fasting may be used, at least in certain people, to reverse T2D. Now, intermittent fasting is not just skipping breakfast. It will only benefit you if it's used to restrict caloric intake in a controlled and well-planned way. And if you want to know more about how intermittent fasting can be used to stop diabetes, our video up here is for you. Now, here's something that will help everyone: journaling. On the road to improving your GFR, one of the best tools you can use is a personal journal. If paired with the other good habits of today's video, it may give you incredible results because now you will see clearly where you are going. For example, the effects of exercising are impressive when it comes to lowering your pressure, and knowing exactly how much you are improving is just as important. Obviously, you can also keep track of other levels such as glucose levels, food intake, your weight, and more. This is an excellent way of seeing what works. Now, to put this together, you can try a morning routine. Morning routines are not for everyone, but that doesn't mean you can't manage to create one. To do that, you will need to free up 1 hour every morning. Consider what good habits of today's video will be more useful for you and put them together in your morning routine. Your perfect breakfast, your morning exercise session, your journaling. We can all be part of the most productive hour of your morning. Remember that these good habits will have a snowball effect on your well-being. When you start doing one small thing that takes some willpower, it will have an effect on other things you'd like to change. Self-discipline is like a muscle. Make it stronger, and you'll have more willpower for other things. Number 4. And there is a good habit that's as easy to start as taking just one tablet before breakfast. Okay, this is more of a supplement, but its effect combined with that of the good habits we just saw will give you incredible benefits. Okay, let's talk about Berberine. This is something we always recommend for those with type 2 diabetes, T2D, but it can be extremely useful for anyone with metabolic conditions. First of all, because Berberine is incredibly helpful for those who need to lose weight. In our opinion, it's one of the very few supplements, maybe the only one, that really works as advertised in this regard. This is what a review of 12 studies proved. Researchers were able to observe a significant decrease in body weight in test subjects taking Berberine. Researchers believe that Berberine works so well because it inhibits the growth of adipose cells at the molecular level. The thing about Berberine is that it is usually paired with certain other supplements to enhance its property. Someone wanting to improve their HbA1c levels and to fight T2D may want to pair Berberine with bitter melon leaf extract, for example. This combination is also known to work better than Berberine alone for weight loss. Some studies also show the ability of this nutraceutical formula, as they call it, to completely normalize glycemic levels in people with T2D. And this is extremely helpful for your GFR because maintaining the right weight is directly linked to less stress on your precious filters. Now, our advice if you want to try this incredible supplement is to get informed about it. Number 3. Good habit number 3. Take care of cholesterol. Another risk we want to take care of is cholesterol. Being able to control it every day means directly protecting the precious filters of the body. Science says that if you want your GFR to improve, you need to keep total cholesterol below 200 mg per deciliter, Ng/dl, and LDL below 100 mg/dl. Never let high cholesterol levels go unnoticed. This is not just a cause of atherosclerosis, a condition in which your organs progressively stop working. It's also a constant cause of damage to the glomeruli, the filtering units, guys. Keeping cholesterol levels under control is a must if you are going to improve GFR. And while the good habits of this video will help with cholesterol too, the best natural way of improving it is a supplement called red yeast rice, RIR. What is red yeast rice? This is a supplement that's born in Asia and that's now very popular all over the world. Today, many people are using RIR to avoid taking statins because while taking a statin, such as Mevacor or Lipitor, is an effective strategy against high LDL, it comes with several unwanted effects. On the other hand, RIR can reduce LDL levels by 26% in just 8 weeks without the unwanted effects associated with statins. Guys, lowering LDL by 26% is a result people can only get with statins. No other supplement comes even close. By the way, RIR is one of the few supplements on Earth that was ever studied as a way to actually repair the damage inside the glomeruli and nephrons, which is really impressive. There are many studies confirming that it really works, to the point that pharmaceutical companies patented an active compound of this supplement and turned it into one of the most used medications today. Number 2. Our number 2 for today is a supplement that was used in 22 studies involving almost 1,000 people in stages 3, 4, and 5 of chronic renal failure, CRF. These studies found that participants significantly lowered their creatinine levels. This supplement is Cordyceps. Cordyceps is quite amazing and is totally worth turning into a good morning habit. In a large study, people with CR stage 4 lowered their creatinine levels by an incredible 18.3% in just 3 months by taking Cordyceps. This means an improvement in the functionality of the precious filters of the body. Lowering creatinine levels is crucial for kidney health, as high creatinine levels indicate that the kidneys are not functioning properly. By reducing these levels, Cordyceps helps the kidneys work more effectively, which is vital for overall health and well-being. Now, what not many people know about Cordyceps is that its main benefit is not just to lower creatinine levels. Cordyceps is incredibly powerful when it comes to stopping proteinuria. Proteinuria is a condition where an abnormal amount of protein is found in the urine, indicating kidney damage. Cordyceps helps reduce this protein leakage, thus protecting the kidneys from further damage. This makes it an excellent supplement for anyone looking to support their kidney health. There are several ways you can take Cordyceps. You can take the extract, which is readily available in capsule or powder form. This method is convenient and ensures that you get a consistent dosage each day. Alternatively, you can use the fruiting bodies of Cordyceps to make tea. This is a traditional method that we personally really love. The tea has a pleasant earthy flavor and can be a soothing way to start your day. In addition to its benefits for kidney health, Cordyceps has other health-promoting properties. It is known to boost the immune system, increase energy levels, and improve exercise performance. Cordyceps also has anti-inflammatory and antioxidant effects, which can help protect the body from various diseases and conditions. When incorporating Cordyceps into your routine, it's essential to choose a high-quality product. Look for supplements that are certified and free from contaminants. If you prefer making tea, ensure that you are using genuine Cordyceps fruiting bodies, not substitutes. To sum up, Cordyceps is a powerful supplement that can significantly benefit kidney health by lowering creatinine levels and stopping proteinuria. Its additional health benefits make it a valuable addition to your daily routine. Whether you choose the extract or the tea, making Cordyceps a part of your morning habit can lead to improved kidney function and overall health. Number 1. Now, for what is probably the most powerful morning habit you can start. This good habit is proven to lower sugar levels and improve insulin sensitivity. It can lower pressure by up to 9/5 millimeters of mercury. It can even fight high cholesterol levels. We're talking about number 1, taking garlic on an empty stomach. Garlic has some amazing properties for people with chronic renal failure, CRF, all of them backed by science. It could effectively help you get rid of hypertension medication, and this is key to lowering creatinine. But it also helps with sugar levels, cholesterol, and inflammation. Taking garlic on an empty stomach every morning is probably the best morning in the world when it comes to lowering creatinine levels. Garlic needs to be prepared in a special way if you want it to work. The active compound in garlic, allicin, is not present in the clove itself and only forms when the clove is cut or crushed and then left to rest for at least 10 minutes. Allicin is what gives garlic its powerful medicinal properties. It is a potent anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, and antimicrobial agent. You can also add olive oil and parsley to improve allicin bioavailability and decrease the odor. Olive oil contains healthy fats that can help your body absorb the allicin more effectively. Parsley, on the other hand, can help neutralize the strong smell of garlic, making it more pleasant to consume. In addition to allicin, garlic contains other beneficial compounds such as sulfur, selenium, and various vitamins and minerals. These compounds work together to support your overall health and well-being. Sulfur compounds in garlic can help detoxify your body by enhancing the function of enzymes that remove toxins. Selenium is an essential mineral that supports your immune system and helps prevent cell damage. Studies have shown that regular consumption of garlic can lead to significant improvements in various health markers. For example, one study found that garlic supplements reduce blood pressure in people with hypertension by an average of 8/4 mg. Another study showed that garlic can lower total and LDL cholesterol levels by 10 to 15%. Moreover, garlic has been found to improve the elasticity of blood vessels, which is crucial for maintaining healthy blood flow and reducing the risk of cardiovascular diseases. Improved blood flow means better delivery of oxygen and nutrients to your kidneys, which can help protect and improve their function. To incorporate garlic into your morning routine, you can simply crush or chop a clove of garlic, let it sit for 10 minutes, and then swallow it with a glass of water. Alternatively, you can mix the crushed garlic with a tablespoon of olive oil and a pinch of chopped parsley for added benefits. By making garlic a part of your daily routine, you can enjoy its numerous health benefits and take a proactive step towards improving your kidney health and overall well-being. Start your day with this powerful habit and experience the positive changes it can bring to your life. And this is all for today. Thank you for being with us till the end. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more such content. Until next time.